do is we're gonna send the recording out with the PowerPoint, the PDF of the PowerPoint that they're going to use today, Christian and Mary and Ben. And so look for that right after the event. And then please feel free to ask questions at any time by putting them in chat, and we'll monitor the chat and make sure they're answered at the end during the Q&A. Usually I'll interrupt and we'll answer questions during the presentation, but we decided that we'd leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to put your questions in chat or even come off mic during the Q&A session. So just a little bit about ESA, everyone. For the past 8 years, we've partnered with ADP to build the ESA community of nearly 3,000 participants. And what we do is we deliver monthly thought leadership forums, hopefully the kind of thought leadership that you might get at a conference board or at a World 50. And then we also have WorkTech startup advisory sessions where you can see early stage startups and what the new startup technology looks like. And at an executive level, we have a board program for those executives ready to navigate to their perfect board seat. And you guys, we're unique. Our network is unique because we believe that we need to bring CHROs, CIOs, and all WorkTech executives together because they have to be in lockstep for the worker experience that's necessary to attract and retain talent today. And you're going to hear this philosophy echoed in the discussion today, as the best in breed companies are figuring out how to deliver the HR skill sets necessary to attract and retain talent with not simply HR resources and headcount, but through the right technology and empowering leaders closest to the employees with that human connection ability. It takes all of those things to really deliver that wonderful employee experience. So today I am honored to welcome back Christian Gomez. He's one of our favorite guests who drives talent strategy for ADP, helping organizations create cultures where the employees valued. Christian's the Vice President of Strategy at the Marcus Buckingham Company, which is owned by ADP. And joining him today are two ADP Research Institute data scientists that will share the research from the largest data set in the world around what is driving the talent agenda today. And we also have Ryan Bond. I think Christian will do a little better introduction of Ryan, but he leads HR for a very large restaurant group in Wichita, Kansas, headquartered in Wichita, Kansas, Thrive. And they have close to 1,000 associates, and he'll add his insights on what has helped them be successful. And I've had the pleasure of eating in Thrive's restaurants in several cities in the last few months. And in every case, I experienced employees who love their jobs and take great care of the customers. And so Ryan will have some great insights to share during this discussion. So with that, Christian, I'm going to turn it over to you. And remember, everyone, if you want to put your questions in chat, I'll make sure that we answer them at the end, or you can come off mute at the end and ask your question then. Christian, it's all yours.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Cindy. So again, it's a pleasure to be in front of you again. A lot has happened since the last time that I spoke to this group. If I recall, last time I might have been actually sharing the stage with Marcus about a year ago. And one of the changes is that it is important for all of us to understand the context about who's going to be speaking today and where their insight is derived from. So I actually now am fully fledged inside of the ADP organization, as opposed to where I was before, working at the Marcus Buckingham Company that was focused on the talent activation piece of the conversation that we typically have around talent. And what that means is that when we look at ADP, it's important for us to look at it in this sense. We have an organization that we know and a lot of us interact with as it relates to products and services that they create. But that same organization, which happens to work with almost, I think they've actually surpassed 1 million organizations worldwide that they handle some scope of the human capital management process for, over a decade ago, decided to invest in an institute, a research institute, that was able to leverage the unprecedented amount of data that they house. And then they hired some of the most talented people scientists in the world to go and study that data and then start to derive insights that the rest of us could benefit from. So in my world, what I do now is that I take that understanding and that insight that they're providing, and my world is to make it useful for leaders like yourself. How do we take that insight and then how do we use that in order to be able to make better decisions and design hopefully more effective strategies? And in regards to what we want to do today is we want to first and foremost acknowledge the fact that all of us are experiencing very, I would say, exciting.
Okay, put it back when I'm done.
It's okay. I know we anticipated that some folks might be off mute, so we'll give them a minute to go off mute or we'll catch them ourselves. But what we were going to, oh, well, actually, it's a good time to remind everyone, if you're not on mute, hit that button. And if not, then when we hear your sound come on, we'll do our very best to mute you as quickly as we can. But what we want to acknowledge is that we are undergoing right now a very dynamic moment in time in the world of work. We obviously are now on the other end of what was a life and professional altering event that really accelerated a lot of trends that we saw happening prior to the pandemic. And the premise of this conversation, which is a conversation that won't be limited to this particular webcast, is around the fact that there's a much bigger onus on leaders like yourselves to come up with proactive strategies that allow us to be able to address the changing dynamics of people at work. And in order to do that, traditionally, our disciplines have relied on what we would refer to as best practices. What is it that I have done previously in my career, or what have other organizations done around this particular topic or this particular initiative that I'm driving? That isn't going away, and we still need to be able to rely on our own personal and our collective experiences to be able to put forth really good strategies in place. But what is changing now is that our understanding of people at work is also evolving. And we have sources of insight like the ADP Research Institute that are giving us data and insight that we can use to inform the types of things that we're doing. Technology is also rapidly advancing. And there are certain things that we need to be able to understand that enhances our capability to be able to do great things on behalf of our people. So as it relates today, the other thing that I would like to highlight about the Institute and some of the folks that you'll be hearing from today is that, number one, the work that they're doing is focused on all facets of the workforce. It begins with the worker, but it also analyzes teams. What do people do when they come together in a particular job function or industry to be able to achieve great things inside of an organization? We look at organizations themselves and we're able to look at patterns that vary across industries, but they also look at what does it look like inside of an intact organization. And then we also have macro data across the entire economic spectrum. And all of that is brought together by the Institute, to leverage an extensive data set of 25 million US workers. And this is very important, nearly a decade of continuing surveys that analyze employee sentiment of some 500,000 workers in 29 countries. What does that mean? That means that we're collecting different points of the employee life cycle and we're counting them based off of what we see happening inside of the systems that house that information. And then we're using methodologies and sentiment instruments that have been constructed and validated to help us understand some of the data tendencies that we're seeing. When you look at the Institute itself, it's actually divided into two different practices. We have the labor market practice that studies all of the transactional data that's happening. Who's being hired, how much are they being paid, who's being promoted. And then you have the people and performance side that is taking this employee sentiment analysis and is helping us better understand the why. What does that mean? How is that being perceived by the employee? And then what subsequent impact is that having on their performance? And today we're really lucky to have two scientists that represent each of those, not just those practices, but the body of work that they put out. And today we're going to analyze a very specific topic, and it relates to the way that an HR function is structured and the impact that it has on the employee experience. What can we have in terms of how we staff and how we deploy all of the people inside of an HR organization in order to have that, hopefully, desired employee experience that will drive performance and subsequent outcomes. So the first person that I'd like to invite to share some of their insight and research with us is actually going to be Dr. Mary Hayes. So Dr. Mary Hayes, are you out there? I'd like to welcome you to the group.
I'm gonna have to move them into their
Hello?
Yep. Go ahead. Can you hear me, Kristen?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. And so thank you for the wonderful introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And make sure that you can see my screen there.
Yes,
Everything
I can.
awesome. So
We see your notes presentation if
Oh.
you are able to go to the
yeah, let
other
me
window.
swap. There we go. How's that? Better?
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Much better, thank
So often within organizations, we ask a familiar question of employees. So thinking about your current primary employee, how likely are you to recommend the company to a friend or family member as a place to work, right? So it's a rating scale that goes from 0, not at all, to 10, extremely likely. An organization collects this information, creates a number, which is the amount of people who say 9s and 10s compared to 0s and 1s. If it goes up, yay, right? If it goes down, boo. But what the heck does it mean, right? Organizations might wonder what could we have done better? What happened? Why did it go down? Given this single question, we will never know, right? There is no actionable information that's gained from this little needle that moves from negative 100 to a positive 100. And so in 2021, ADP Research Institute sought to create actionable intelligence that an HR organization could use. And the model we built has a 5 person-centric ideas that are measured by the 15 items. So I'll build the questions from the bottom with the needs to the top. So these, as you can think about these are non-negotiables, right? And I'm not going to go deep into the model today. If you want more information, it's on our website, adpri.org. And Chris, we will put the information in the link. As we go up, we have safety, we have value, we have grow, right? And all of these are what we would consider in the wheelhouse of HR, right? Things that HR can influence to make a difference in the employee's world. So we use these 15 items to sort organizations into 3 different levels, right? So the levels are value promoting, which is defined as employees who see HR as a net positive. Performing, employees who are content with HR. And value detracting, employees who view HR as a net negative. The 15 items contained in the survey allow us to know in detail where we are winning with employees and where, as HR professionals, we may be falling apart, right? We have collected the data over the last 2 years with managers and individual contributors and have distilled these findings into 3 key points that are within the control of HR. So these 3 points are onboarding, HR contact, and technology. What does this model matter for HR? I'd like to first set the stage to say that we see a strong relationship between HR value and intent to leave. Right? So the question we ask in our sentiment surveys is focused on an employee's desire to work for a different company. We don't know if they actually leave the organization, but it's more of an intent. And so we have intent to leave on the one side and considering or in the process of leaving, right? They're actively looking, they're actively interviewing, or if a recruiter came to them, they'd say, yeah, maybe I could go somewhere else. And so we see that while there's a strong relationship From past research, we know people join organizations for the mission, but they leave because they're direct leaders. So the relationship is strong between leaving behaviors and value detractors. It's not a one-to-one relationship. HR is not in direct control over employees leaving an organization most of the time, right? But we see that those who are staying are 4 times more likely to be value promoting than those who are leaving, right? The opposite is true, right? Those who are considering leaving are 2 times more likely to be value detracting. So the opinion of HR is related to what's going on here in this intent to leave. But as I said, we were going to look at 3 big buckets, right? The first one is by onboarding formality. The first touch point, once hired, is often the onboarding experience. For most organizations, this is a direct influence by HR. We ask the formality process of the onboarding, which would range from extremely formal to not at all formal, and then looked at the number of promoters and detractors by formality. The point of this slide is to see that formality matters for employees, and the more formal the onboarding process, the more value individuals see in HR. We thought, how long does this formal onboarding stick with employees, right? Maybe our sample is skewed just to new workers, but what we found is the after effects of extreme formal onboarding do stay with employees. The observed variance in the variable is about 13% of our overall sample, which is about 50,000 for this survey alone. 13% stated that they had an extremely formal onboarding, 23% very formal, 29% somewhat, 16% slightly, 16% not at all, and about 4% responded they don't even remember. So what we do see is that the extreme onboarding group maintain their positive feelings of HR years later. The next point of HR influence is being there for employees and managers when needed, right? In large organizations, as well as small organizations, the way employees contact HR is ever changing. We ask a simple question about how employees typically contact HR. I have one dedicated contact for my needs. I must contact different HR person, department, depending on the situation, or my company has no HR department. The last category is removed from these analyses. But we see employees who have a dedicated contact with HR, some person as a go-to. Maybe it be I go to that person and they ship me somewhere else, but at least I have someone to contact. They are 3 times more likely to be value promoters than detractors. Employees who have to contact different departments are 2 times more likely to be value detracting. We completely understand that the size of the organization gets bigger. It becomes much harder for one person, for 100 or even 1,000. And this is where we took the next step to understand that technology can help, right? So we looked at the different groups of value promoters in the one dedicated contact, the different HR person. We looked at how the employees, how the managers and the individual contributors stated that they contacted HR. So am I calling someone? Am I logging onto an interface? Or is there an app for that, right? The number of promoters is highest among those who can access an app to deal with their HR needs in each of the contact types. As a member of a generation that I didn't have a cell phone or the internet, I would still like a person to call, but technology is key to a big proportion of the workforce. The number of workers who have had technology at their fingertips their entire life is about 66.6 million workers between millennials and Gen Z. And if you add in to the mix the Gen X generation, then you add another 42.8 million who are also comfortable with technology. Understanding the importance of the two younger generation and their love for apps may just help HR contact and staffing in the next 5 years. Back to you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Mary. I love, obviously, I've geeked out with this report since it was released, and I love seeing all of the updates that it has. And I just want to note that, again, the report is on adpri.org. So I highly recommend that you download the full report. Mary just went and took a couple of the areas that we believe that provided the most signal, gave you the ability to be able to see when you study employee sentiment as an outcome, how do employees feel? What are the things that we're seeing that HR is doing that can actually drive that positive outcome? So I want us to look at it through the lens of that. The second point I wanted to make was that one of the things that I remember from working so closely with Marcus for so many years, he always said that the best research wasn't necessarily the ones that showed you something you didn't see, but it was one that reflected what you saw that was already happening. And that's really something we need to think about when we're looking at this research, and particularly what we're about to see from Ben, is that what they're showing us is what the data is revealing as they are studying tangible data points across large, vast of subjects. So as we're looking at this, it's giving us insight that then we use to inform a conversation that we juxtaposition against what each of you are doing inside of your organizations, which is why this forum is so useful. So with that being said, I would like to now bring on stage Ben Hannawell from the Research Institute, who's going to share with us additional context around what the Institute is seeing as it relates to HR staffing and its correlation to some of what we're seeing around the topic of turnover. Ben, are you
Thanks
out
a
there?
lot, Christian.
Hey, sir.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks for what you were sharing, Mary. This is really interesting research that we've done here, and I just want to review a few things that Mary just said to us. One of which is something that we as HR practitioners and people leaders and people analysts would hope to be the case, which is that the HR experience is strongly correlated with whether or not our workers want to stay or leave us. So it suggests that it is something that should be invested in, right? The HR experience. And then one of the three key points that, and by the way, everybody can see my screen now, yeah? You see a question being raised there? Okay, I'll get to that question in a second. But one of the key points that Mary raised was about the degree to which having access to a dedicated HR contact is positively associated with people's perceptions of the HR experience. And that calls to mind a question, which is, what is the capacity of that HR contact? You know, as an HR business partner, for example, you know, accrues more and more workload through you know, being that contact for more and more employees, the quality of that service will potentially degrade, and so will the HR experience or the worker's perception of it, and thus it will potentially increase a worker's intent to leave, and then turnover, and then has implications for turnover costs. So that calls to mind another question, which is about HR staffing ratios. You know, first question here is, to what extent are employers trending in terms of how they're investing in HR staffing as the lever to pull to try and improve the HR experience, especially in the face of recent economic and labor economic conditions? And then the other one is, you know, why does pulling that lever potentially actually have an impact? And then given how much impact it has and how strongly you have to pull that lever, what does that mean for what we should be doing and how we should be investing in that capacity for that dedicated HR contact that people appear to want? So does your HR staffing ratio matter? And the great thing is that using the massive and unmatched data set that we have beck and call here at ADP, millions of workers, thousands of employers. We can directly observe people's occupations and their direct reporting structures, which means that we can identify HR staff from other employees. And we can also directly observe when people leave their employer. And my colleague, Jeff Nazai, published a report in the ADP Research Institute's data lab at adpri.org/data lab last May. And he was looking at two things. And the first is the trend in HR staffing ratios. And he found that HR staffing since 2018 has been on the rise. So 10.6% since 2018 through April 2023, we've seen a 10.6% increase in HR staffing ratios, in average HR staffing ratios over that period. That's what this chart is telling you. On the horizontal axis, you have the year. On the vertical axis, you have the average HR staffing ratio in that year across all the companies for which we can measure the HR staffing ratio. Now, that is telling us that this is a lever that possibly is getting pulled when people are trying to improve their HR experience. Now, when was this trend? When did most of this trend begin recently? Well, recently this trend appears to have begun in 2020 in the wake of the pandemic. Now, in 2020, there are obvious reasons why we might have seen a slight uptick in HR staffing ratios. We had in many companies, we had people. We had HR departments that had to move people from the office to work into their homes. In other companies, we had all of the transactions and challenges you face when you're furloughing large portions of your workforce. And then in addition, what we had during 2020 is interest rates right now are very high and everybody's complaining about them. But during 2020, there was a drop in interest rates as a means to try and save the economy from the economic shock of the pandemic. And that paired with shifts in consumer behavior as many people were finding themselves at home and having a little bit more money than usual to burn because they're not going out. These things together made it so that that many employers thought that this was a great time to grow. And as many of you probably know, the economies of scale in trying to grow when it comes to having the HR staff to support that growth, they sometimes aren't very good. And so that might be another reason why we saw these HR staffing ratios rise in 2020. But what about after that? Why did this trend continue? So we think that tightening labor markets are implicated in the continuing rise in HR staffing ratios, right? As the economy started to open back up, all this pent up demand and also large personal savings rates, all of that conspired to increase demand for labor. And we, of course, had the Great Resignation begin, where we saw a massive bump in quits rates. But really, that was just a continuation of a trend that was occurring even before the pandemic, where we were seeing workers be more and more mobile and switching jobs more and more often over time. And so it seems that a lot of that was coming to fruition here. Okay. So HR staffing is on the rise, and that means that one of the levers that and it's rising in response to tightening labor markets and the need to keep that good HR experience, probably to improve retention, or at least to keep it steady, or to keep it from rising too much. And so they're pulling that lever, right? And that means that's one way that they're investing in the HR experience. So, okay, so why might you pull that lever? So one of the other findings that my colleague Jeff Nazai found in this report is that turnover is highest when HR staffing ratios are lowest. What you're seeing here is a graph that shows on the horizontal axis ordinal buckets of the HR staffing ratio. And then on the vertical axis, we see the average monthly turnover rate. Actually, the average monthly turnover chances for on average for companies within that staffing ratio bucket. And the first thing to notice is that when you travel from the first lowest HR staffing ratio bucket to the next lowest, there's a 12% drop in the monthly turnover and that shift between those two buckets occurs where an employer's HR to employee ratio goes above 1 HR staff per 200 employees. And then the second thing to notice is that the lowest turnover rates appear to occur when if we're middling, at least in the middle of this range that we're seeing here when it comes to the HR staffing ratio, and then bumps up a little bit again when HR staffing ratios are a bit higher. And this means that there's at least an apparent sweet spot, or evidence that there might be a sweet spot for HR staffing ratios when it comes to turnover rates. And the jury is still out on whether this is just a correlative relationship, or if this indeed, this chart that I'm showing you is a representation of how your turnover rate will change if you change your HR staffing ratio. However, the fact that there is a sweet spot consistently across different company sizes, and by the way, this sweet spot is like most strong for large companies. The fact that this apparent sweet spot is consistent suggests that there might be something here that we should pay attention to. But how should we pay attention to this information, right? What should we do about this? A naive way of thinking about this would be, well, if we want to minimize turnover costs, thus minimize turnover, we should seek that sweet spot for the HR staffing ratio for our, that is, for a company with our profile, right? But it's probably not that simple. A less naive way of thinking about this, let's say you're where most companies are, which is in the lower end of HR staffing ratios. A simple HR staffing decision rule here would be, let's say that HR staffing ratios are the only, or maybe the most feasible, or the quickest or the most efficient lever that you can pull for whatever reason. You'll do that so long as the marginal reduction in turnover costs that emerges through that relationship between HR staffing ratios and turnover. If that marginal reduction in turnover costs is greater than the marginal increase in HR headcount costs because you're hiring additional people, and that immediately throws into sharp relief the massive HR staffing scaling problem if this is the only lever that we are pulling. And indeed, I've already shown you evidence that it is a lever that companies are pulling in response to one of the biggest economic shocks that we've seen in recent years. So imagine a company with 1,000 employees and with an already ludicrous HR staffing footprint of 200 HR staff. By the way, there are companies that have an HR staffing this size that have an HR staffing ratio of 0.2. They're not very common, but they exist. Anyways, for this company who already has a ludicrous HR staffing footprint, their expected monthly turnover chances, according to the graph I showed you before, 5.7% per month. Now, if they want to move into another regime, right, get to an HR staffing ratio of say 0.5, bring them into that next HR staffing ratio bucket. Yeah, sure, they'll decrease their annual turnover rate by 12%, probably actually a little lower because they're only like at the low end of that next bucket's range, right? But they're doing so at the cost of hiring, training, and paying 300 additional HR staff. So they're more than doubling their team. And if they had a more reasonable baseline HR blueprint of say 20 HR staff, they'd be hiring and training and paying an additional 480 HR staff. So what this is telling us is that, well, I've shown you evidence that HR staffing ratios are on the rise. So it's clearly a lever that we're pulling in response to a tightening labor market where it makes sense to improve the HR experience so that you can improve your company's retention and reduce turnover costs, right? But perhaps there are other levers that we could be pulling instead that might be more cost effective and maybe even more effective in general. So to start that part of the conversation, I'd like to turn it back over to my friend Christian Gomez, who's going to
Thank you so much,
another
Ben.
one of our guests.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I think it's key. It's important. It was very intentional around how we wanted to present both data sets to you, because one data set is showing us what is the potential impact that the HR function has on an employee, particularly in the areas that we believe will have a subsequent impact on attrition. The second data set is actually just looking at the numbers. When we study companies and we look at their attrition rates, and then we look at their HR staffing levels, what trends are we seeing? Now, what comes next is what I think the most valuable part, because now we need to be able to apply real world context in terms of what's actually possible. I do want to provide a quick reminder. Keep putting the questions in the chat because Cindy and her team are monitoring them, and we are going to address all as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation with the group of panelists. But what we want to start to look at now is the dilemma of there are certain patterns that show us certain strategies and processes and optimal staffing ratios that seem to have a correlatory impact on attrition and employee sentiment. How do we bring that together in the context of a real organization with real people doing real work in the real world? And that is where our next speaker is really in a position to be able to give us that insight. So what we want to be able to do now is hear from somebody that is actually having this conversation every single day in the context of what they're weighing in terms of what their resources look like. They're looking at the constraints of their particular industry and what the demands are of the business and the employees, and they're using their available resources to be able to create the best outcome. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Ryan Bond on board, who's the Chief People Officer of Thrive Restaurants, and very excited to just hear your context in terms of how this is impacting you and what are you doing to be able to position your HR function to create the very best possible employee experience. And then from that point on, we're going to start to incorporate the questions that you have provided as a community and start to look at, well, what can we learn from the inside and how does that apply to you and your particular organization or industry? So Ryan, are you out there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic. I'm so glad to be with you all. I tell you, it is energizing listening to those slides, taking in that information, because what I see in those slides is that the work that HR does has a tremendous impact in the lives of the people that we employ, in the ability of our businesses to succeed. And I told Ben yesterday when we were kind of prepping for this session, we've got 8,000 employees across 18 states at Thrive. And I told him my eyes were bleeding a little bit at thinking about having a team of 1,600 HR professionals. And so we were all laughing about that. But in seriousness, what we have done is I believe fundamentally that getting HR as close to the employee experience as possible is key. We're not going to employ a team of 1,600 people to do that. What we're going to do is figure out what are the key elements, the key value drivers that HR can provide, and how are we going to equip our leaders that are responsible for the people on a day-to-day basis? How are we going to equip them with those skill sets and those competencies? So if you talk to anybody on my team that's 15 people strong, so I think our ratio is 0.0015, what they will tell you is their job is not to just process payroll. It's not to just administer benefits. It's not to just deal with employee relations. Their job is to equip every single leader in the organization with the ability to do those things for their teams. We believe that when an employee has a competent manager, someone who's responsible for them, that they trust because of their demonstrated skill sets, that's where we see our reductions in turnover. That's when we see increasingly high performance. But the only way to get there, and what we've learned, is how do you see the people that you're creating an experience for? And I've noticed that there's two camps. There's one camp that sees people as a risk to mitigate. There's another camp that sees people as potential to develop. And you can talk about formal onboarding practices, interviewing, progressive discipline, feedback, coaching, training, and you can see how very different all of those experiences will be if your lens is this is a person, a risk to mitigate, versus this is a person with potential to develop. And we just happen to believe at Thrive, which is why we changed our name to Thrive, that, man, we have such a great opportunity to develop people's potential and give them a place where they can work, where they can be their natural best self, because we've equipped their manager to be able to provide the conditions that they need in order to thrive and flourish in their work. And so we're in the hospitality business. We love people. We love food. And it's experience that we create every day. Cindy's been in there without me, has been in our restaurants, which can sometimes be a different experience. And I just love hearing her stories. And so, Christian, am I hitting on what you wanted to
No,
discuss?
you are.
Like,
I do. What I want to be able to do now in this segment of the conversation is the research, as I said, is we have individuals with different disciplines that have certain expertise that are taking real data and are helping us be able to identify patterns that could inform the opportunities that we have in order to be able to drive the outcomes that we want. So you nailed a really, really good point. And one of the question was asked earlier, well, are we able to look at those staffing levels and those ideal staffing levels by industry? That's a key question because it does vary dramatically depending on the industry that you're looking at. As Ben noted, there are organizations that have this optimal a ratio. And Ben also noted on the chat that one of the other questions was, do we know what types of functions are driving this growth? Recruiting is one of the biggest ones. We have more recruiters being brought on staff than we did before, and that's driving that number. There's also HR analytics, and there's a lot of other roles that we typically would not associate with the ones that have a direct impact on the employee experience. But what is important to note is what is that end user experience? What drives that end user experience? And what can potentially a higher staffing ratio do to be able to support that experience? So one of the analogy that I know, Ryan, you and I talked about prior to this session is my personal experience with my insurance provider. And one of the things that they've done that I think is very brilliant is that they use a local agent strategy. It's a marketing tool, to be frank, that says, Christian, in your area, you have a gentleman named Michael that is looking out for your best interests. You can go to him for questions, and he can help you design the version that's going to best support you and your needs. The reality is I've never met them, I've never interacted with them, but I know who that person is and I know their name. What they have done is that they put an ecosystem around me that is based off of processes and technology that allows me to make sure that my needs are met and that anything that I need to do to interact with that provider allows me to do that. But there is a sense of familiarity between me and that function. That is something that I have seen the best HR departments do very effectively. They take advents in technology, whether it's generative AI-driven chat tools that allow an employee to easily navigate an HR system to be able to update their information and get answers to their questions. But that employee knows that they have an HR business partner, even if they don't necessarily interact with them directly. And you kind of described something that I think is pivotal. It is the onus, the emphasis, and some of you on the chat described it as an employee experience-centric mentality as it relates to HR. Yeah. That is really where it begins. So one of the things that I would like to do now, Cindy, and again, I just want to reiterate, Ryan, you're one of the best examples that I've seen in being able to do that, because so many people are in your position in the sense of, I have a workforce that thrives, pun intended, based off of their experience at work, meaning that the way they're treated and the way they show up and the way they're developed is going to have a direct impact on the way that they interact with your customer and their ultimate experience, in your case, in terms of when they dine at your organization. And if you ignore that and you take solely a transactional approach, you're going to be missing an opportunity to position them in a way that's going to not just create a better experience, but ultimately drive the bottom line of your organization, whether it's through the lens of attrition or it's a lens of customer satisfaction and likelihood to return and recommend it to others. But Cindy, I'd like to take this opportunity for you to kind of jump in and help us be able to communicate some of the really fascinating and relevant points that are being made in the chat so that we can channel those questions back to the group, our two scientists and Ryan, to be able to kind of advance the conversation as it relates to the way that this topic and these data points and insights are impacting their own world.
So I'm looking at a lot of the comments and questions. Ben, you've done a great job of answering some of these questions already. I'm having to go through. I don't want to repeat what's already been answered. Jill Beckman just said, I agree on that. Onboarding, HR contact, and HR technology are all important, but support 100% Ryan's comments on equipping managers. Salon, you had a question. Would it mean that 1,000 employees 500 would be HR people, and then Ben answered the question. I think people are having a little question about how do you calculate the HR to employee ratio?
Yeah, it's just
Expand on that, Ben.
sure. It's the ratio of HR staff members to total employees, and then expressed as a number of HR staff per 100 employees in the graphs.
And then another kind of overall theme that I'm seeing that you've also addressed, Ben, is can you make a differentiation between the kind of industries, and would that staffing hold true for, say,
Yeah.
a service or a manufacturing organization? You want to just comment on that?
Sure. Yeah. So a couple of things. In the article, we do break out both of the main results I showed you by industry supersector. The first thing to note is that HR staffing grew in every industry supersector from 2018 to 2023. And then the second thing to note is that in nearly all industry supersectors, we do see this pattern where, I think it's except for education, we do see this pattern where when moving from that lowest HR staffing ratio category to the next lowest, average monthly turnover also decreases.
I think
across almost all industry supersectors. So what we have not done, however, and what I would like to do in the future is to see the composition or the degree to which each industry supersector is contributing to the turnover rate trend, and it's not just industry, right? I mean, you think about it. I mean, yes, certain industries have higher turnover rates than others, but that's because of the mix in terms of occupations within that industry. It's really that certain occupations have higher or lower rates of turnover, and even within the same industry. So in future research, we'd like to control for those occupational characteristics as well as industry characteristics to try and more rigorously identify the causal impact of HR staffing as well as other HR organization compositional characteristics on turnover rates.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, and then there was an early question from Steve, which I think you might have answered, but he wondered if the data on the kinds of HR jobs is there data that certain HR jobs are driving that increase in HR staffing? And he said,
yeah,
okay. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Sure will. And this is a really interesting finding that is actually kind of inspiring me to think about things that we can do this year that might make a real big impact in terms of understanding the labor market with some leading indicators. But okay, so a big factor, not the only factor that was driving a lot of this increase, was recent growth in recruiting functions. And you would expect that in an environment where, right, we have a lot of hiring going on because there's a lot of job switching going on. But recruiters, year-over-year growth in recruiters as a share of all HR job holders, it was accelerating. The rate of that growth was accelerating into 2022. From 2021 to 2022, that the share of recruiters that make up HR grew by 11%. But here's the thing. Now we have a cooling labor market. It's cooling still to a quite balmy temperature, right? Please do not overinterpret the cooling of the labor market. We are cooling to like a labor market right now that's like maybe like it was in 2016 through 2018, not like it was in 2011. But anyways, but we are cooling. And as a result, what we see is, at least back in April, what we had seen so far is that the recruiters as a share of HR for year to date in 2023 had grown by less than a percentage point from 2022. So that slowdown is commensurate with the cooling of the labor market and the drop in hiring and job openings that we've seen in the job openings and labor turnover survey that we get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it also shows up, by the way, in the hiring and in the hiring rates that we calculate from ADP data.
And then also, Cindy, it's important to note that what the folks are doing right now for us is they're being curious, they're looking for patterns in the data, and they're reporting it to us. And then part of what we're doing right now, as we speak, frankly, is gauging professionals in the industry, particularly senior leaders, to be able to understand what is the context around how you're receiving this, and how does this reflect with the way that you're looking at your functions. One of the key things for us to understand is that all research is provisional. So I can see Ben and Mary's brains working, going, okay, now that means that I'm going to double, triple click in this area now to better understand how this dynamic impacts another area that I know is very important to the individuals like yourselves that are setting up the staffing of an HR function. The other thing that I'd like to note is, and I'd love, for example, what Mary talked about in terms of one of the things that she found in the data was there was a direct correlation between organizations that had a formal onboarding program as opposed to those that did not. The reason why that's highlighted is because, again, the data showed a disproportionate correlation in that area. There's other research that has been conducted by the Research Institute and by other institutions that show that not all onboarding strategies are equal, or they explain to us why onboarding is so important in the first place, where we look at employees that are either entering the job market or they're entering a new organization. One of the very first things that they need to understand is, where do I fit in? Where do I fit into this new organization, whether it's in an existing industry that I've already worked in, or in a new culture, or maybe even a brand new job function? Other research that the Institute has had that I think is incredibly relevant to this dynamic is the fact that onboarding an individual onto an organization is only the start of the conversation. What's actually even more impactful is your ability to ensure that your formal onboarding program addresses the need to onboard an individual onto a team. And a lot of times that is missed in a formal onboarding program. It's just about, how do I get you into the company and help and teach you all of the history of the organization and what that means to you as a new employee. But what about you in terms of your new leader, in terms of your new teammates? How are you going to come together? How are you going to bring the best of yourself at work, as Ryan alluded to, as something that is really important in the way that they onboard new employees? So at the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is exactly what we see happening right now, whether it's on the chat or what Cindy is moderating. We want to start a conversation. We want to make you curious. We want you to look at things that you might not have looked at in the past, and you might not have given them the importance that the research is saying that maybe do merit a second look. So those are the types of things that we want to start to do as a result of these items. When you look at, there's another body of work that allows the Institute to be able to publish its research, and it's called the Today at Work Initiative. And this is an initiative that is publishing their research on a quarterly basis and allows us to be able to give updates on prior research. For example, the data that Ben shared today is something that is giving us more insight on the research that Mary has been working on for years now. So the Today at Work initiative allows us to be able to continuously update what we're learning about people at work based off of our data, and the way that we iterate our research based off of our interactions with leaders like you and your organizations and in your respective industries. So I just want to also acknowledge that.
Yeah, and Christy put the Today at Work link in there for you guys. Christian, Steve Hunt is bringing up, I think, kind of the question that I've had on my mind since we started talking about this session. He said there's an interesting relationship between Mary Hayes and Ben Hannawell's work in terms of HR staffing levels and employees feeling a personal connection to HR staff. What's the best way to integrate HR staffing levels, HR job types, the use of HR technology to strengthen trust in the HR function? It's kind of all of those things, right? So what's the best way to do that? And do you guys have any answers to that question?
When are you asking the community, or are you asking for our
I guess I'm asking if somebody in the community has an answer to that. I'm really kind of asking you guys if you've done any work in that area, because that's been the thing on my mind as I've thought about this, is how do you get the right mix of the staffing, the technology, and then to Ryan's point, making sure that the front level managers know what to do.
I do want to draw back on what Ryan mentioned, because I really think that's key. And if we are going to highlight a best practice, I really think that needs to be it.
Yeah.
And that is, when you're investing, because whether you lead the HR function or you're partnering and you're leading in the technology function, you are allocating the limited resources that you have, and you're determining from a prioritization standpoint, which are the ones that are going to create the outcomes that matter most. So what we've seen in terms of general best practices, which is not something that is incredibly new or innovative, but the way that it's being done is actually being done in new and innovative ways, is making sure that from a transactional standpoint, you have the right processes and technologies that are not putting a drain on your HR function. So when you are looking at the different HR roles that you're hiring for and what your staffing looks like in an HR function, you should have the ability to be able to automate or drive the utmost efficiencies in the areas that deal with the transactional elements of HR. And then what we've seen as our recommendation is exactly what Ryan is doing, putting the proper emphasis on the employee experience. And then if you are able to free yourselves up by making the right technology investments to handle the transactional, now you can actually start to take some of this headcount, some of these roles, and then transition them to the areas that have a direct impact on the way that an employee feels. And that could be, it could be a recruiter that finds them and helps them join the organization. We are seeing much more emphasis on culture and roles that are focused on how do we intentionally craft the right culture that represents who we are, creates the right image in our communities, and ultimately has a material impact on the way employees show up at work. But
Hey-
that was my high level framing, but I'm very curious to hear from the group in terms of how that impacts them personally.
Ashley Nelson has put in chat something I think is really important. There's many factors to consider what is done in-house versus outsourcing. And then it's really kind of how do you determine HR staffing when you're outsourcing some of the things that you do? So Ben, I think you answered it. You said yes. One thing that we cannot see in our data, aside from the use of ADP's own offerings, is HR outsourcing. Very good point. A key drawback to our approach, we should be in the future look at the sensitivity of our results to reasonable assumptions about what effective HR staffing is when accounting for HR outsourcing. And the
Right.
other thing that Ashley mentioned several minutes ago that I wanted to bring up as a question is generationally, and she's talked about this because she's been a guest executive in some other of our thought leadership forums. Generationally, if the more of the younger generation you have, is technology more important? Because there's definitely a different way that you communicate based on the generations that are in the workforce. Can you guys talk to that?
I can say a few things about how we think about technology. We're a very dispersed organization. So like, we're across 200 locations in a bunch of states. We look at it through three lenses. So whenever we're thinking about technology, is this going to displace something? Is this going to take it over? Is this going to disrupt? Like, where is it going to interrupt or radically change a process? Or is this going to enhance or improve the quality, the value, the delivery of it? And what we look to do is take what are the things that we need to be delivering that are best delivered by a human being to a human being. If we can enhance that with technology, awesome. We're very rarely going to displace something like that with technology. And like, for example, we do checkouts with servers every single day. They have to have their tips, brought in. Sometimes they do tip shares and all that. We've been doing that manually for the better part of 6 decades. We just brought in technology, payday portal through ADP to basically automate that. So all of a sudden, all of our managers have 1 hour back every single day to have a better conversation with people at the end of their shifts because they're not calculating tips or tip share. It's automatically being done and it's automatically being distributed. And so when we put that technology in place, you could say, well, now you don't have to meet with somebody after their shift, right? It can just all be push a button and you move on. But we're saying, hey, leverage that time back into how'd you do this shift? Check in on the shift. Check in on how they're feeling. Same amount of time. So we did not saving money. We actually paid for the privilege of bringing the technology in. Plus, we want them to reuse the time. But we know that creating that connection by having technology do something that's non-human is going to improve the overall experience. And so those are the 3 lenses that we look at when we're thinking about, do we pay for something additional? Do we not? That's how we look at technology.
Wow, an hour. That's a massive amount of savings when spread across your entire
Huge.
organization, which
It's
is
huge.
wow. I mean,
Yeah.
how many managers do how many managers are in
We have
your
we have 700 salaried managers. And so
My God. Yeah. Wow. That's
so
amazing.
basically, but
That's
200, there's 2 shifts a day. So basically you've got 200 so 400 hours a day
Yeah.
coming back.
Wow.
You guys, I am sorry, but it's time. And I always,
Oh.
I know, this is such a great conversation. Thank you so much, you guys. I mean, Ryan, you were amazing. Ben, Mary, Christian, this was great. We'll have to do this again. I always like to do part 2, and this might have to be a part 2, Christian, if you're okay with that.
Always
Okay.
welcome. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everybody for being here.
Take care, everybody.
Appreciate
Have a great
all the
Thursday, folks.
conversation.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.